Well, hello and welcome to those of you who are now joining our webinar. We will get started officially in a couple of minutes. We have a lot of attendees, so we want to make sure everybody can get into the webinar before we get started. So happy to see so many people interested in this topic. I think we had more than 150 people register, so that's wonderful. Thank you very much for your interest, and I'm glad that you could join us. So we will be hearing from our speaker for much of the hour, and at the end of his presentation, we will open it up for questions. We will ask you to put your questions in the chat feature, which is on a laptop on the bottom of your screen. Click on the chat balloon and type in your question. You can do that anytime during the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, I'll bring those questions to our speaker. Well, we may not have everybody with us, but I think that for time purposes, we should get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Joy Cardine. Welcome to Plato Madison's Hygge, Health, and Happiness lecture, brought to you in cooperation with Badger Talks, which is UW-Madison's Speakers Bureau. This lecture is being recorded and will be posted on Plato's website. We're going to find out more about the Danish concept of hygge today, and how we might use this sense of warmth and well-being to help us through a pandemic winter in Wisconsin. Our speaker is Claus Elholm Andersen. He's a native of Denmark who came to Wisconsin in August of 2017. He's an assistant professor of Scandinavian studies at UW-Madison. He's been teaching in this field for more than 15 years at places including the University of Minnesota, UCLA, the University of Texas at Austin, and the University of Helsinki in Finland. He conducts research on Scandinavian culture, history, and literature. And I know we are all looking forward to finding out more about hygge and how it's connected to health and happiness, and how we might all embrace this idea, not just this winter, but year-round. If you have questions about hygge, please type them in the chat feature. I will present them to our speaker after his presentation. And now, please join me in welcoming Professor Claus Elholm Andersen. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Joy, and thank you for this generous and kind introduction. I'm really happy to be with you, at least virtually, at Plato here on this kind of gray Thursday morning. I just want to, once again say I'm really happy to be here. And what you will see now is I'm going to start sharing my screen so you can follow along on my slides. And as Joy mentioned, the title of my talk today is Hygge, Health, and Happiness. And before I get more into that, I just want to once again mention, as Joy already did, that I am a professor of Scandinavian. I'm the Paul and Renata Madsen Professor of Scandinavian Studies in the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic here at UW-Madison. And I've been here for 4 years. I'm really proud to be part of this department. It is has a great history, and in fact, Scandinavian Studies at UW-Madison is not only, as it says here, the nation's first Scandinavian Studies department, is in fact the world's first Scandinavian Studies department. And just in a couple of years, as you can tell, we will be celebrating 105th anniversary. So that's something we're very, very proud of. But with that, let me turn to Hygge. And as we all know, Hygge is all over the place. There has been numerous books published on Hygge. The most famous of those is The Little Book of Hygge, The Danish Way of Living Well by Mike Viking. And it is, even though it has a W, it's pronounced as a single V in Danish. That became an international bestseller. Many of these books on Hygge kind of functions like what I will argue is self-help books. They seem to say, if you embrace Hygge, if you do what the Danes do, you will become happy as the Danes, in knowing that the Danes in many of the World Happiness Reports have been listed as the most happy country in the world. My argument, however, is that it's a little more complicated than that. It is not just that Hygge in itself lead to happiness. What is missing in that equation that we find almost uniformly in all these books is the concept of health. And with that, of course, comes the Scandinavian, the Danish welfare state that I think has played an important part in Hygge and how it leads to happiness. And that's why my talk will be very sharply divided into three categories. First one on Hygge, the second on health, and the third one on happiness. I should also let you know that even though I'm here talking about Hygge, and I've done it in several contexts, Hygge is not really my main focus of area of research. I conduct my research in especially contemporary Scandinavian literature, more specifically the novel that I'm very interested in. But I'm also interested, though, in Hygge, but more as a cultural phenomenon and how it is related to the concept of being Danish. And with that, let's then do a little bit of pronunciation exercise and simply look at the word Hygge. Hygge is pronounced Hygge. And you can sit at home now and repeat it after me. I'm going to say it a couple of times. Hygge, Hygge, Hygge. The two G's kind of create a soft sound, Hygge, Hygge. And my definition of the concept, which is what we return to repeatedly, is pleasant togetherness. But before I get to that, let's look a little closer at the word. One of the many definitions of Hygge that we'll find is that it is a quality of coziness and comfortable conviviality that engenders a feeling of contentment or well-being, regarded as a defining characteristic of Danish culture. The word, even though we today say it's a mainly Danish word, actually originates in Old Norse. There we have the word hygge or hygg, that means to mind or to thinking. If any of you know any Swedish, you kind of find it in the phrase kom ihåg, to remember something. That is the same root of the word hygge. From Old Norse, it then moved into Norwegian, where it was used as the word nice, to say something was nice. That's something we still hear in Norwegian today. If you ever go to Norway and people want to say something is nice and you had a good time, they would say, "Det var hyggeligt." That was a nice time. From Norwegian, it then moved into Danish in the late 18th century. But for a long time, almost 100 years, the meaning of the word in Danish was identical to the Norwegian. But in the late 19th century, in the late 1860s, the 1870s, and especially in the 1880s, that changed. And that was where we see that Hygge started indicating something that was cozy, comfortable, and contentment. A big reason for this change, why the word took on new connotation, has to do with simply the probably most traumatic event in more recent Danish history. That is the Second Prussian War in 1861. In that war, the Danish Prime Minister at the time, P.G. Monrad, was at every step of the way outsmarted by Prussia's Minister of War, Otto von Bismarck, and the whole thing culminated in the battle at Dybbøl Møl on April 8th, 1864, where the Prussian army overran the Danish army and killed in the span of a few hours 8,000 Danish soldiers, and in effect eliminated the Danish army. That meant that Denmark lost, as you can see in this map here, the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein and Lauenburg. It meant that the country overnight lost a third of its territory and a quarter of its citizens. In fact, the only reason that Denmark still exists as an independent nation today is because of the mercy of the Germans. They took over, invaded the majority of the country, but then withdrew to the northern part of the Schleswig province. After that, the national pride was completely defeated. Denmark had lost Norway 50 years earlier. And to make matters even worse, Danish main export at the time, which was grain, was also being overrun by the Americans, who introduced better and cheaper grain of the European market. So there was a huge crisis. And what do you do in a crisis? You turn your back to the world and you say, we're good enough the way we are. And that became the motto. The motto simply in Denmark after 1864 became, what outwardly has been lost, inwardly shall be gained. And it is in this environment that Hygge takes on a new connotation as coziness and contentment. We're good enough the way we are. We don't have to care about other people. We can just be together in our own small, tiny little country and not care about what others think. That's what we see Hygge come into the place. And with that in mind, I don't think it is a coincidence at all that Hygge was shortlisted for Word of the Year for the Oxford English Dictionary in 2016, the year that England voted for Brexit, or that the books became bestsellers on Hygge became bestsellers also here in the US in 2016, 2017, with the election of Donald Trump, who at the time, of course, ran on a platform of isolation. Today, the word Hygge is simply used in a number of contexts in Danish, and also in a number of grammatical functions. It is used as a verb, at hygge, to hygge. Like we hygger os, we are having a hygge time, where you see it as a reflexive verb. We also use it as a speech formula, hygge dig, du må hygge dig, which basically means take care, have fun. But you can also use it as an adjective. Det var hyggeligt, that's where we see it from the Norwegian one. Det er en hyggelig by, that's a hyggelig town. Og det var en hyggelig aften, that was a hyggelig aften, evening we had the other day. It can also be used as fixed compounds, like one of my favorite ones, which is noun Hyggespreder. This is someone who spreads hygge. He's a real hyggespreder. You can also talk about a hyggeaften, kind of if you are a couple, you don't want to go out. Well, in these COVID times, we're all staying home anyway, but otherwise you want to stay home. You want to embrace being alone, sitting with a bottle of wine and having a romantic night. That can be a hygge night as well. You can also talk about julehygge, Christmas hygge. You can do hyggesnak, which is hygge chat, which is basically like chit chat, or you can talk about hygge musik, hygge music. And all of these also exist as verbs, where hyggesnakke, but also one of my favorite verbs is at hygge nyge, which is kind of a rhyming replication of hygge to create this cuteness effect in it. And finally, I think we can also just briefly just mention that the opposite of hygge, uhygge, is creepy, and uhyggelig, which means scary or uncanny. And with that, I will return to my original and very, very brief definition of hygge as pleasant togetherness. When I define hygge as pleasant togetherness, there are two elements at play here. One is the question of the atmosphere of hygge, what makes hygge, and then there's the social aspect, the people that are creating hygge. So we have atmosphere, the components that make hygge, and then the social people creating hygge. If we look at them more closely, we can look at the atmosphere here. Here, one of the very, very basic things we talk about when creating an atmosphere of hygge is candles. It is basically what all the books on hygge say. Many of them even have it on the cover of the candles. What the books fail to mention is that the sales of candles have actually dropped drastically in Danish in just the last few years, as there's been several studies showing that burning candles indoor creates has a negative effect on the indoor climate of your house. That said, as a Dane, even living in the US, 8 months of a year, when my family have dinner here in Madison, we always have lit candles on the table. That is simply that's just a given. That's something we always do. The other thing to create this atmosphere of pleasant togetherness, of hygge, is the indirect or the accent lighting. I remember the first time I visited my in-laws they live in San Diego, and we were having dinner. And San Diego, as you know, is a very sunny and light place. But still, we sat down at the dining room table, and my father-in-law, he turned on what I call the stadium lighting, which is basically 400 wall light bulbs that just burst lighting to the dining room, ruining any sense of hygge and that coziness that you create. Indirect unaccent lighting is something that has been very important for the Danish designers, especially in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And what you see here is probably the most popular lamp you will find over Danish dining room tables. It's called PH5 after the designer, the cultural critic, Paul Henningsen. And it has that effect that it gives an amazing and steady light throughout, but all of it is indirect. So that is the indirect lighting. The next thing is a hot drink, coffee, tea, simply sitting with something that makes that bit bond where we both sitting, all of us are sitting, blowing on something that is hot. In the summertime, that would typically be exchanged with red wine, at least in a Danish context. And then there is, of course, for the atmosphere, it has to be relaxed, whatever we put into that. That was the atmosphere. Then there's the social aspects. Here, closeness is important. Simply the fact that you sit close together, you eat together, you spend time together, and we don't have a huge couch where you're sitting on opposite ends or someone is standing up. No, we're all sitting down and we're all together. Because what is it that happens when we sit down? Well, scientifically, what makes our taller or not so tall is the length of our legs. So when we sit down, we become more equal. We look into each other's eye height. And then the atmosphere has to be friendly as well. That means that you listen to others, you encourage them in what they're going through and in what they are saying. That does not mean, as some of the books on Hygge seems to suggest, that you should not discuss politics. Danes love to discuss politics, and I would argue that it's an important part of Hygge in itself. But then there's another thing, and that is the question that the Danish society is a very equal and egalitarian society. It is much easier to create that closeness and friendliness with someone who belongs to the same group as you. And the homogeneity of the Danish society historically has been something that has been emphasized in terms of Hygge. And then also, we should not forget that Hygge, in a Danish context, very much is a middle class phenomena. Even though the majority of the country is middle class, it's certainly not something we see in the lower class, and it's used also by the middle class as a means of social control for the upper class. For instance, if you see someone who has a big house, extraordinarily big, large, big living room, the most negative thing a Dane can say, and they often say about big houses, is that is not hyggeligt. So that's kind of a way to bring them back to earth. And then finally, an important part of that is that it has to be stress-free and tensionless. That means that you shouldn't worry as much, that there shouldn't be all these, when you come home from work, when you want to sit down with friends and family, you're fully able to relax. And this is where, and now I move from Hygge into health, the second part becomes important, and that is the question of the Nordic welfare state. Oh, let me get here. The Nordic welfare state in Scandinavia, in Denmark, is very much what helps create that stressless and tensionless social component of Hygge. Simply because that when Danes sit down, there is a host of things they don't have to worry about. The majority of the major thing here, of course, is that of healthcare. And if we look here in the US, right, we know that healthcare is, and this, I should say, this poll here is prior to COVID, that healthcare simply is at the top of Americans' worries. If you look at Americans' worries during COVID, it is very much also having to do with healthcare and being able to afford what's going on. That worry is taken out of the equation in a Scandinavian context. And as such, it creates, as Anna Parson at least has argued, it creates a freer citizens, because there's so many things you don't have to worry about. You don't have to worry about in the welfare state also whether or not your elderly parents will be taken care of. You don't have to worry about the cost of college for your kids. You don't have to worry about daycare for your small children. Those things are kind of addressed. So it creates a freedom to embrace things like Hygge. Another thing that the welfare state does, and that's something that has been we now see as extremely efficient during COVID, is the notion of flexicurity. That is the golden triangle where a flexible labor market with a generous welfare system and an active labor market policies simply work in unison. One of the big myths, I think, about Scandinavia and Denmark in general is that unions kind of created an atmosphere where it is impossible for employers to do much in terms of hiring and firing people. That's what we know from France, for instance, and that's what we know in some cases here in the US as well. Denmark is a heavily unionized country, yet at the same time, it is one of the countries in the world where it is easiest to hire and fire people. Why is that? Why has the unions agreed to that? Exactly because of flexicurity. That if you have a flexible labor market where it's easy to hire and fire people, if you then lose your job, you have a generous welfare system that picks you up. Make sure you don't lose your healthcare. Now, make sure you don't lose your house, don't have to sell your car, and kind of makes a bridge for you until the next job. And at the same time, it have active labor market policies that help you being activated and find a new job. That creates a dynamic in the whole labor market. A very good example is that a small town in Denmark outside the city of Ringsted a few years ago had a slaughterhouse that, just like here in the US, announced to the labor department that they were closing down and had to lay off 500 people. Of course, that would be devastating in a small community, and it certainly would have been there as well. Very quickly, even before it closed, the local labor department came in and worked specifically with each of the employees, to the extent that just 6 months after the slaughterhouse closed down, 95% of the employees had found new employment. So that's kind of how flexicurity works. But it makes sure that you don't have that worry when you sit doing Hygge. And then that also means that you have a more positive life work balance. All the way to the right, if you can just see it there, is where we have Denmark at the top of the life work balance, whereas the US is a little further down. You don't have to work quite as much because you don't necessarily have to worry as much about losing your job. Because if you lose your job, you're definitely not going to lose your healthcare, and you for sure will be picked up for a period of time until you have a new job. And then, of course, there is the question of college as well. So that was the health and how that kind of creates this, the welfare state creates the conditions upon which Hygge is based. And then now look at happiness a little bit. For the past 15, 20 years, the UN has every other years, right, released their World Happiness Report. Right now, if you look at it, Finland is actually at the top of the list after having Norway being on the top, and prior to that, Denmark for the first many years topped the lists as the happiest country in the world, which is why we like to say that Denmark is a happiness superpower. But of course, how can we measure happiness, and is that even possible? And it's something that has been boggling sociologists and economists for quite a while. And up until the World Happiness Report, there was really not a way to measure the well-being of a population that seemed sufficient. Instead, what you used the financial ones. So the question to how are you doing, the answer could be, I make XXS amount of dollars a year. In other words, you would look at the GDP per capita to measure the well-being of a population. That certainly is not a good way of doing it. But another answer to that question, right, why we might be a little why we might be a little hesitant to talk about happiness as something that is measurement, is like, if you get me on a wrong day, right, pick me up and I pick up the phone and I'm just like, I'm grumpy and tired, you can't really use that for anything. That's why when we talk about happiness, we talk about two kinds of happiness. We talk about the affective, and the affective really is the little girl down in the corner there. She looks like my daughter. She is not my daughter. But let me just say, there are mornings when I get up at 6 in the morning and she screams and won't eat her breakfast, that my happiness certainly is very, very, very low. But that's why we also operate with the question of a cognitive happiness, where it exactly is taking all things together. Would you say you are A, B, C, and D? And here the ways the happiness report operates with 10 different levels and includes other things in terms such as freedom, equality, corruption, and so on, to measure that question. So what is it that we know about happiness? Well, we know one thing that leads to happiness, that those who report the highest level of happiness, what brings happiness is community, friendship, and togetherness. If you see people, if you're with people, if you feel you live in a community and you're engaged in that community, that is what brings happiness. Unfortunately, this notion of community, friendship, and togetherness is something we see declining, not just here in the US, but actually in most of the Western world. And it's quite well documented, as some of you might know, in Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, that came out in, I think, 2002, if I am not mistaken for that. The title refers to the fact, and it's based on the US, that what Putnam's observed was that here in the US, we see a decrease in bowling leagues, but an increase in people bowling. In other words, more people are bowling alone. Putnam, he also operates between two really interesting concepts, what he talks about as bonding social capital and bridging social capital. And what he is saying is that what we find more and more of is bonding social capital and not as much bridging social capital. So let me just briefly try to explain those concepts. Bridging social capital, that is simply where we get to meet and interact with people who are not like ourselves, and gets to see how other people live, how they interact. And here in the US, the draft historically was a really good way of bridging social capital. You got to see and be exposed to people who look like, thought like, different things differently than you did. What bridging capital, social capital, is being replaced with is bonding, that we more and more end up living in groups, in neighborhoods, that among people who look like us, think like us, and act like us. I live on the west side of Madison, not far from West High, and most of you probably know that it's a little friendly referred to as the Professor Ghetto. And we all know what people in my neighborhood vote. And we all know that most of them drive Subaru Outbacks. And we all know, I mean, from there, we can just kind of list a lot of things that people, my neighbors, seem to enjoy. And what is the problem in that? Well, the problem is that I sent my kids to school, and especially my 12-year-old, even though it's virtual these days, is that the people he meets in school are just like him too. They are the children of academics, doctors, professors, and others. So he does never experience this bridging capital. And that actually means that you feel, and that is Robert Putnam's argument, that you feel less part of a greater community. You feel less purpose because you might just be in your own little community, but not in a greater one. What we find too in the US, right, is that more and more people say that they are lonely. And with loneliness, of course, comes less happiness. Loneliness, we know, has a huge impact on our well-being. And in fact, loneliness has, some scholars argue, the same effect on our mentality as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. I think that is why, I mean, one of the important aspects of Hygge and why Hygge with health leads to happiness is the idea of sitting down, eating together, embracing meals together. And of course, we all know the food pyramid that I put down here, but just last year I learned, it was a little bit of a surprise to me, that in France, you not only have the food pyramid, but you also encourage people to never eat alone. Here in the US, a book came out a few years ago with the title Never Eat Lunch Alone. But that was about networking, right? But there's actually something right here. We should never eat lunch alone. We should never have meals alone. Because if we invite colleagues out, if we, of course, during COVID, do it virtually, make sure we have these coffee dates. That is where we experience a sense of connectedness, purpose, and togetherness that is so important in us feeling happiness in our lives. The last thing I just want to talk about a couple of minutes is the relationship between happiness and money. And my favorite one, of course, is money can't buy happiness, but it can buy wine, which is pretty much the same thing. We know that what we call conspicuous consumption, simply just buying fancy things, does not lead to happiness. That's a given. And we have known that since the 1890s. You can go out, you can shop, you can buy new things, and it gives you this instant gratification. But after that, the fall into depression just becomes even worse. But money actually can buy us happiness in other ways than just by buying wine, for instance. If you make $20,000 and move up to $50,000, we know that your happiness doubles. You simply just have less worries, and you are able to buy things for yourself, for your children, and not have to worry about every single thing you do. From $50,000 to $100,000, there's only a slight increase in how much happiness we actually experience. And some scholars have tried to figure out what is the ideal income for happiness. Where is it that we have the most life satisfaction? And the number they end up with is just around 100,000, 95,000 is the ideal income for life satisfaction. And making much more than that, it simply means that you does not make you happier. And there's a point too where the tips over and it makes you less happiness. It make you less happy. Yet we can somehow maximize happiness. And this is at least what Elizabeth Dunn and Michael Norton argues in their book, Happy Money. We can buy time, we can buy experiences and memories, we can buy treats, we can pay now, consume later, and we can give to others. And let me just explain a couple of these. Buy time simply means that I can, and again, pre-COVID, not now, buy time by saying, well, I can afford hiring a babysitter tonight so I can go out and have a date with my wife. Or I can say, no, I don't want to do my own yard work. I'm going to hire someone to do it. And that gives me more time for myself, with my family, whatever I want to do. I can buy experiences and memories. I can go to concerts and buy those tickets now, but don't look forward to them. So those are some of the ways that we also can increase our happiness. And now just an area I don't know too much about, but I should say there's some research now that suggests that there actually is a reverse relationship between happiness and money. That not that money buys you happiness, but that happiness means that you make more money. Happy people simply have a higher income and tend to make more money because people want to work with them. You want to be together with them. You're someone who has a positive impact on the workplace. So there might be a reverse, very interesting relationship between the two. With that, the relationship between health and happiness, we might say here at the end that good health leads to happiness, and happiness leads to good health, that leads to happiness, and so on and so on. And with that, I'm just going to end up by saying embrace Hygge, and happy holidays, and Merry Christmas, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I learned a lot. I had no idea with all the history. And we do have a lot of questions, and I asked people if they practice Hygge, and if so, how. And we had a couple of people who responded that someone who said, yes, I practice it, and I didn't even know it had a name. Every morning sitting in the garden, or just with a cup of coffee for an hour in the quiet. And she has battery candles so she doesn't forget to blow them out. Can you, Professor, can you practice Hygge alone?
I mean, in my definition, as I gave it here, I would say no, but Danes do use it that way as well, right? But the way I interpret the concepts of Hygge, it is a social issue. That doesn't mean that you can't enjoy yourself by sitting alone with a book. I do it all the time. I love sitting alone with a cup of coffee and reading a book. But I think it might not, in the strict sense of it, be something I would refer to as Hygge.
Yeah. Another says that that she still tries to make sure it is a part of life. The holidays are a good example. The little Yule, it's all about the candles, family, food, and conversation. And I always tend to have candles lit during winter evenings. That brings me to another question. Someone's saying, what advice might you have for those who live alone during this time, and especially during the pandemic when we're not supposed to gather with groups outside our household?
I mean, my advice would be the same, I think, as many psychologists would say: use Zoom, use whatever virtual you mean you have to connect with someone. I think the first couple of times I had virtual coffee with someone, it was a little weird, but you actually get used to it, and it makes a difference. It grounds you still among friends and family. And as someone who has been living now for years away from from my parents and grandparents. We have used FaceTime, and it still creates that sense of togetherness. Something, of course, is missing, but I think that would be the best thing we can do, is to try to reach out. See if you can just sit at an evening, have a cup of coffee with some of your friends.
Yeah, I had our first time Zoom family Thanksgiving. It was actually post Thanksgiving, and we had our pie, and we were able to talk and see each other, and you know, see how the kids have grown up so much. And actually, it was wonderful because we saw people that we wouldn't have seen otherwise in person at grandma's house. You know, we don't all travel and all meet in one place, so that was very nice. We have other questions where someone says, do you think increasing media use and online life, speaking of Zoom, has had an effect on the decline in community friendships and togetherness?
I mean, this is speculation, right? But I mean, definitely what I see with children these days is that it's a battle about screen time, even before COVID, and whether or not they should interact with their friends there, and as well. And I think it's certainly has had an impact. It's not as much the one that what we see today is not what Robert Putnam talks about. He more talks about TV as being part of it as well, right? And there we see how cable TV, going from the big networks, had a huge impact on our way of thinking, not just in terms of, like, the obvious example would be Fox News, but that is not the only one, right? We watch TV shows, the same TV shows as our group of friends watch, that are aimed at our socio-economical group. So yes, it certainly has an effect.
Yeah. Do you, we had some questions about do you have to be rich or at least middle class to practice Hygge?
It's a middle class, I mean, in a Danish context, it's a middle class phenomenon, right? I mean, the middle class is what affords that lifestyle, right? And that is the big criticism of Hygge as well. Danes like to present it as a universal concept, but they're simply blind to their own ignorance about it as being a middle class, white, and somewhat heterosexual concept as well. That is something that fits in the nuclear family more than an alternative lifestyles, and not something you really see much embraced by Danish immigrant communities. As I mentioned in the talk as well, it is also used in a Danish context, right, to criticize the upper classes as a means of social control, right? That is not hyggeligt, is the phrase you hear again and again if someone builds a house that is too big or too fancy. In other words, it's saying this is not Danish, we don't like it. And someone who is struggling to get food on the table, I don't really think that they necessarily find anything appealing in the context. So that is certainly an aspect of Hygge that we should be aware of, problematize, and address critically.
Yeah, we talked a lot about how there's this sense of well-being and warmth, and having our hot beverage and our warm sweater, maybe by the fireplace with candles lit. But what about, I mean, you can go outside and practice Hygge, can you not?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that many of the books write about, that Hygge will talk about, is it as a winter phenomena, right? That is something that we can use to counter the darkness of the winter, simply by embracing that darkness and make our living rooms nice and cozy and cave-like. But for me, the image, and this is me very personally, if I think about Hygge, that is just one aspect of it. The other aspect I'm thinking about is the long summer nights where the sun hardly goes down and you're sitting outside, maybe in a sweater, maybe with a blanket around you, and talking to friends or family into the wee hours of the morning. So yes, it is not just an indoor phenomenon.
We have one of our attendees said, making art is my Hygge or Hygge, painting and writing, but I would add aromatherapy and pets to the list. I am alone all day except weekends. P.S. I thought this lecture was on hedge funds or hedgehogs. I was not disappointed.
Yeah.
You want to just comment on pets and making art and aromatherapy, whether that plays into this?
I mean, I think that's how you choose to interpret it, right? If that's your way of finding that contentment, I think that's, I mean, that's what you should do. Aromatherapy is not something I associate with Hygge in a Danish context per se. And pets are not necessarily something I would include as well, although I could easily imagine like a dog or a cat being part of it, lying on your lap while you're sitting talking to people.
Yeah. Before COVID, one of our attendees says, I was part of a trivia group that would meet. We would always claim a small corner in a restaurant that had soft chairs and a fireplace. The conversation was always good. No one was more important. We were enjoying each other's company.
Right, and there you have the question of equality and egalitarianism, right? That when, and that goes back to the question also about the middle class phenomena, right? When we all belong to the same class, it becomes easier to have that tensionless atmosphere that creates Hygge, because there's no tensions between high or low or anything else, right? So when you take that out of the equation, that makes it easier. But again, it's also something we have to problematize and be critical of in the concept of Hygge.
What is the difference between Hygge and the Swedish word lagom? How do you pronounce that?
Lagom, right? Lagom is kind of, I mean, it's just the Swedish equivalent of Hygge. It's a little more of a relaxed, casual lifestyle, and probably extends to more things. If I look at it as from a cultural perspective, and not necessarily in terms of context, lagom is not as much part of Swedish national identity as Hygge is part of Danish national identity. If you go to Danish tourist websites, you will find, and you have seen this for decades, the word Hygge is always there. It's something that Danes claim is purely Danish, something that characterizes them as a nation, the way of living, their interactions, engagement in so many things that you won't find with lagom.
So what do you think Americans can learn from Hygge, health and happiness?
Hopefully they can learn a little more of the work-life balance that is also included here. Learn to slow down, relax, sit down and talk, engage and listen to other people. And embrace that relaxation and spend as much time with other people as possible. Of course, it is a little more difficult in the US, because the US is very much a country of mobility. People move all the time, and very few people end up living where they were born. So that means that you constantly are exposed to new people. You might not create those lasting, deep relationships with as many people. That certainly is my case, right? I have moved a lot in my life, and every time you have to make new connections, and you have to make quite an effort. If I compare myself to my sister, she's like most Danes. 90% of Danes end up living, I think it is 50 miles of where they were born, which means that she still, on an everyday basis, see people she went to elementary school with, went to high school with, and her circle just expands and expands and expands. And there's this long-lasting relationships that is much harder to maintain in a country with the mobility and dynamic that you have here in the US.
How do you feel about the commercialization of hygge in the US?
I think it's inevitable, but I think we also just have to be critical about the concept. We have to look at, as I mentioned in my talk, when was it introduced here, right? It was introduced at a point when the US decided, by electing Trump in 2016, to turn its back to the rest of the world. That there is that aspect. We're sitting here in a circle, embracing each other, people who are like us, look like us, and leaving everyone else out. That aspect we have to be critical of. But in terms of the community taking time to relax, I can only think that is a good thing that it's being commercialized that way. And I think my point is it is a concept, despite the books that have come out, that it's hard to commercialize. Yes, there are hygge candles, and I actually have a hygge candle at home, and I quite enjoyed my hygge candles. But otherwise, it's not something you can easily monetize in other ways.
Do you think it's just a fad here? I know it's not a fad in Denmark, but is there something lasting about this?
I think so. And I think if you look at what an American living room looks like today, and what you see new generations, how they decorate, how they use design, lighting, other things, compared to a generation ago, you certainly see changes in the interior, what I refer to as the atmosphere that creates hygge. So I think some of these issues will have a lasting effect. You also see it certainly, of course, in politics, where I argue that the welfare state is something that has been important for the development of hygge. You hear more and more those voices here in the US that want something that is closer to a Scandinavian welfare state. So I think on a personal front, in how you build your house, and also on a more political front, yes, I think it will have an effect, however slight that might be.
Running short on time, but a couple of questions we didn't get to yet. Someone wants to know if you would consider yoga to be hygge, in that it's quiet solitude, but usually practiced with friends.
Yes, it is practiced with friends, but you don't necessarily have that engagement, right? That social aspect of being engaged with other people that you find there. And I would be too, I mean, that would be speculation. But if you make it into a Hygge event, I'm sure it can be. You can do Hygge, and then you can do yoga, and then you can sit and talk over a cup of tea afterwards, right? Then we certainly would have that aspect. But that would be speculation.
Yeah, and you mentioned that candle sales in Denmark are way down. We had somebody who wondered if electric or solar candles are used in Denmark, because they seem to be ever more popular here.
Yeah, I mean they're electrical. They're not solar. The one that are used in Denmark that you see, and I think it's something. The second largest supermarket chain in Denmark a couple of years ago reported a 40% drop in the sales of candles, and that is significant. And it's really something that I noticed too when I visit families and friends, that many of them have exchanged their candles to electrical ones. If we want to talk about renewable energy, again, they're not solar, but 40% of Denmark's energy come from windmills. So they are, well, if not 100% renewable, at least 40% renewable.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. One final question for you is, what would you like us to take away from your lecture? What might we take away? How might we today practice some Hygge?
Pleasant togetherness. Take the time, sit down, interact with people. I can give you an example of something I do with my family, and that is that every single weekend in the afternoon, we have what we call afternoon coffee. And it's just a steady, and it's developed into a tradition to the extent where my kids, if we don't have afternoon coffee, they get anxious. And it simply means that we sit down, my wife and I with a cup of coffee, the kids with a glass of milk, and have a cookie or a whatever we have. Sometimes we bake a cake, sometimes we don't. And we just sit and eat that for 5 minutes. And it kind of provides a nice break on a Saturday afternoon where you get to see your family who might otherwise be spent all over the house. So those little moments is really all it takes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Claus Elholm Andersen, who is a UW-Madison Assistant Professor of Scandinavian Studies. Thanks to everybody for joining us for this lecture on Hygge, health, and happiness. It will be posted on the Plato website in a couple of days. So thanks for being with us. Happy holidays, everyone, and see you next time.